embarrass myself first and say that I actually didn't think it was about a person physically starving themselves, but that he was just talking about hunger artists in general. It's like starving artists in like New York who are like trying to get their art out there. And it took me like the first 2 columns, and I was like, oh wait, this guy's doing an act. It's performance art. So I'm a dunce, but that was my first impression. It's like, whoop.
But I think it is that.
Yeah.
Right? It could be a metaphor for that. Yes, you have this literal man, this man who is literally starving himself to death as a performance, but then it is also, he is a starving artist,
right.
And art versus science. And you see that in a lot of Kafka writing, but I think you do see that in this piece a lot.
Yeah.
So I think you're not wrong.
When you started talking, I started thinking about, oh no, I took this story too literally. So I hope that our students can see, look at how we have totally different perspectives. You know, we all love literature. We've done this for a long time, but you know, you just have to not be shy about putting out your opinion on a given text.
Right.
I'll say something. It was actually the first, as far as I know, the first Kafka piece of writing that I've read. I like some of the ideas, and I associated with the idea of like him having this struggle that he couldn't like fully communicate and always felt misunderstood even until the very end. Like he was saying like, this is easy for me, but people are giving me praise because they think it's really hard, but it's not hard. And I try to tell them. And then when I tell them that it's easy, they don't believe me and they think it's a part of my act. So I thought that was interesting that he was like trying to get this message across, and no matter how he did it, he always felt misunderstood.
Yeah, not to spoiler alert, but it reminded me of Siddhartha. Where he talks
Spoiler
about the first.
That's always somebody.
The end doesn't spoil it, but and that was his first thing. It's like, you can learn this, you do almost anything, you know. But for this guy, yeah, he had no choice.
Right.
This was what he was always going to do. So to go back to your idea of like him as a starving artist, like an artist maybe doesn't have a choice but to do that. They have to be a painter because that's just what they were called into.
And I think too, as an artist, and I'm not one, but I can imagine, you hear people say this all the time, that as an artist, you have an intention, but you can't control what your audience gets from it. You might have a completely different intent, and they're going to receive it in a completely different way.
Right.
And I think that goes, and that's the beauty of it, right? But it frustrates him, and that's a question as to why. Like, why does he feel like the need to control? Why does he get frustrated with his audience not understanding his true purpose? Or thinking that somehow he's getting snuck food and, that he's not authentic.
I think it's interesting to think about the idea of like how perspective is shaped too. That's what it brought up for me. Like, his perspective is that like people are not appreciating him, or the perspective is dependent on your experiences, right? So if you had a certain experience, maybe you view the hunger artist one way versus if you had a different experience, you view him a totally different way. So you could either see him as like this beautiful man, like trying to make a point or starve himself with a purpose, versus like a crazy lunatic who's just starving himself for attention.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's pretty interesting. And I also thought it connected interestingly to Borges and I, where they talk about, where the whole point of that story to me was like the inner self versus like who you present yourself as to the world, and how those two versions of you kind of like work against each other and with each other, and kind of have to learn how to like coexist. I felt like also in the hunger artist, he had to kind of wrestle with those two versions of himself as well. Like, how do people perceive me? Like, what's my outer perception versus like how do I feel inside about it?
Tie that off. Nice.
Don't edit that part. The other thing is that it's kind of ironic, or totally ironic, I guess, that at the end, when he could finally fully be the artist that he wanted to be,
Right.
that led to his death, right?
Right.
He's like, you're holding me back by saying, I can only do 40 days, and I'm so frustrated by that. Let me see how far I can go. I can go further. And then they're like, fine, he joined the circus, and they're like, go as long as you want. And then they found his body, you know, and then they're like, he was like, felt freedom by being like, I can express myself in the way that I want to, and that led to his demise. And whether that's symbolically or literally, I thought that was interesting. That it was like, that's what he always seemed to want, and then when he got it, it ended awfully.
So I'm gonna stir the pot a lot. I stir it up. I don't think that this story is about the hunger artist or fasting at all. I think the story is about the panther. So the whole story sets up Kafka like moves more and more and more towards the panther, and we see this human condition of dissatisfaction, right? And that's connected to fasting, right? This idea that I have to look a certain way. Society has set up for me to be this way, an artist has set up for me to be this way, so therefore I will play this part. And the more we play these parts, the closer to death we become. And just because we've embraced that doesn't mean that there's goodness in it. And so at the very end, right, he's asking if he can do these things, and he feels misunderstood, and there's all these things. But at the end, no one appreciates this art that he's trying to do because there's no life in it, right? The last couple sentences say that somewhere the strong passion from its throat, so easy that spectators could not like control themselves from watching it, right? They choose the panther because the panther is full of life, and life will ultimately devour darkness. Life will devour whatever those things are, because the panther is the winner in this story, and he just fades from existence. As much as he put into it, he fades from existence, he fades from memory, because people are attracted to the panther. And so I think that Kafka is trying to kind of put our disillusionment and our ideas of self-importance to the side and say, like, choose life in the midst of all this craziness. So do you feel like Kafka is critical of the hunger artists, like his pursuit? Because, you know, at the beginning of the story, I think, like, oh, he's so loyal to it, and even like throughout, you know, he's,
Right.
and you know, I think you can equate that with different kinds of art in general, right? Like, you have to be so passionate to stick with it, even if you're that starving artist. So I'm just curious what you think, Mrs. Stowe, if you feel like he's in some way critiquing the quest because it's not full of life, or
I don't know if he's like, I think that he's showing the reality of the quest that we all put on, is that we can get fixated on this one thing. And he confesses at the end, like he leans into some of his last things and he apologizes, right? So he has this understanding of whatever's happening, but he also I'm trying to figure out how to say it. Like, he represents, can you ask your question again? Because I went one direction.
sure, like, I guess as a reader at the beginning of the story, I find myself admiring the hunger artist in a lot of ways, even though I think I can't imagine doing this, and it seems really unhealthy. But he's doing it for the art. He's doing it too because he's loyal and passionate about it. So the fact that he suffers and dies, and the fact that the panther wins, I wonder if therefore is it, like, when we think about tone and the attitude toward the subject, is the story actually critical of the hunger artist because life and the panther win?
I think a little bit, because I think there's that, like, that's what I love about literature, is that there's these multiple ways to interpret it, right? And one, you can totally dive into this like idea of an artist, and I think that's all valid and real. But at the end, the hunger artist confesses that it was easy for him, right? So all these people are like, how do you not do this? And he's like, because it was easy. I couldn't find any food that I liked. So is that a true artist? Like, is there something to the challenge of life of choosing things that we have to have grit and resilience for, or does he just choose this because it's kind of like a default, and he never had any zest for life, which is what drove him to be a hunger artist, versus the panther is like, I am driven to consume and to like be, I don't know, engaged. And so I don't know if he's necessarily being critical. I think he's just maybe commenting on, like, there are all these aspects of humanity and art and like passion and performance, and those things are real to us. But at the end of the day, in comparison to those that have life, you fade, like his years faded. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it's interesting. I'm just going to add on to what you were saying, Ms. Stowe, about, because it reminded me of most of Kafka's writing, if not all. I can't speak for certain on this particular story. Most of his writing was published posthumously, so after he died. And he has huge hang-ups with his father. His father forced him to become a lawyer, and all he wanted to do was be a writer. So he would write and write and write and write, and it wasn't until after he died that everything was found and then published. So in a lot of ways, when you're talking, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's his father. Like, that's his father's perspective coming in. That's the father's voice. And then there's him fighting that, and how do I be my authentic self? And is it authentic? Because I have to play this role. Even as an artist, I'm playing a role. Like, wow, it just got really heavy and deep. You just added a whole, thanks for stirring the pot.
Yeah.
Stirring the pot. That's awesome.
Mrs. Lopez, do you want to jump in with any reactions to the story?
Yeah, I mean, when I read this story, I was so frustrated with the main character throughout most of it. I just wanted to like shake him and be like, it's a thing. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And then throughout the story, as it became more clear that he feels kind of like this is what he's good at, and why not? And I don't care about food anyway. And it just added to this sense of like, what is the point of this? You know? And I think that led me to think about what is Kafka trying to tell us about society and how we treat people who are artists or who are just doing something strange that we don't understand. I think that does tie in to what Jen was saying about, Ms. Lopez was saying about the father potentially, and how he was frustrated with his son, and his son knew it, and he knew he couldn't live up to what his dad wanted for his life.
Maybe the big cat at the end is what his dad wanted for his life. He didn't want a starving, frail, ill, maybe mentally ill person or an artist of any kind. He wanted a machine, and so maybe that's what the panther could represent.
I feel like it could also be his reaction to his dad pushing him to be that, right? So saying like, if I'm not doing something that I'm passionate about, I would just fade away into nothing because I'd be doing it because I was told to do it instead of embracing. And I might just be rewording something somebody else kind of already said. But it might be, yeah, his dad wanting him to be more like the panther. But for him, he's like, if I'm the panther, I'm going to kind of like fade. Just my life is going to fade away because I'm not passionate about what I'm doing. So it's like a response, like kind of like a response to what his dad wanted.
And the last thought, and this is something I wanted to communicate to students in general, we know that this is a really intense story. Borges and I was also like not the easy kind of start off, and so hopefully through this you guys have had a chance to see that like a lot of people approach it differently. And you know, I know that this whole year we're just going to set up a giant like trigger warning. This year is about talking about lots of hard concepts that are real, concepts that we should embrace and discuss. And if you are struggling, please reach out to us, because every single student's going to hit one thing or another where they're like, I don't know how I feel about this. This is really personal to me. I can embrace this and move forward and like challenge myself even though it's personal, or I really need some space. So we just want to encourage you guys that like it's okay for this to be messy. Like literature is messy, and you can see that we all had great opinions and different ideas and tried to make it our own. And so this is a safe space. We want you guys to talk to us and dive in.
Think and have fun.
And do a lot of reflection.
And write about that reflection.
And embrace the chaos.
Yes. Yes. All right.
Bye.